for a few folks to show up. So thank you for coming today to what we hope will be an annual event. This is the second time we've had a get-together to talk about Bitcoin and blockchain-related technologies. We had them last year, a meetup here in the building at D-Space. The D-Space is the Deloitte Innovation Lab located on the main floor in the Corporate Innovation Center. And I'm the director of that. My name is Norm Malik, and we've got a small prototyping team there. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So basically, I want to get right to the point so we can get going on the agenda, because we started a little bit late, but we have lots of time, so we don't think we have to feel rushed. I want to encourage people to ask questions today, and I'll let each speaker we haven't planned this out, but each speaker can give you an indication if a question is appropriate during the presentation or at the end. I'll leave it up to them. I just want to make a few remarks, maybe just to set the context for this, at least the context as I see it, and you're going to hear different perspectives today. From my perspective, I see blockchain as kind of part of a family of kind of evolving technologies that has not only the potential to do things better, faster, cheaper, which I think is what businesses today look at, but also to be disrupt many of the current business models out there. So I think there's two aspects we need to think about when we think about blockchain technology. This family of technologies, really, there is a family of technologies around blockchain. We'll just list a few that kind of are top of mind for me as a computer engineer. Cryptographic secured APIs, distributed hash tables, decentralized browser-based applications, peer-to-peer distributed file systems, and some of the new commerce protocols for implementing contract law. Those are all really interesting to me. I'm sure you could add to that list as well, depending on what you're interested in and what you do in your day-to-day job. Finally, I think one of the challenges we're going to have in this room as we kind of think about how to use blockchain technology, both practically from a technical perspective, as well as from a business perspective to kind of influence stakeholders towards considering the technology, is to create economically viable solutions today, right? So we can incentivize the bigger investments that need to be made in the technology so we can get through these disruptive ideas. So you probably read the paper, you read blog posts, you read a lot about what's going to be disrupted, but there is that kind of squishy in-between layer, in-between time, where we actually need to show value. So I think that's one of the challenges we need to have. The second challenge, in my opinion, is everybody has their own perception of what blockchain is, right? They think about blockchain, they read a bit about it, and then you walk away with, oh, it's a database. No, it's an open ledger. No, it's a development platform. No, it's a network enabler. No, it's a decentralized computing platform. No, it's a trust-based layer for the internet. I think that's one of the more popular ones floating there. It's a medium for exchange, or it's a secure pipe. It really just depends on what your background is and how you look at it. So what I'm hoping today is we've got a diversity of speakers, enough diversity in speaking. We're going to touch on all this diversity that I just mentioned. So I'm happy to introduce our first speaker today. We're going to run from about now to about 4:30. We're going to kind of run at a good pace. But I want to leave lots of time for Q&A because it's a symposium. We want to make sure that people can take away some sort of value from today's session. We're also going to have a break in a few minutes for some treats, so we don't have to worry about the sugar dive at 2 or 2:30. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. This is Dr. Julie Maupin. I had a chance to sit in on a presentation earlier this year at SIGI, where you are a fellow, and you're also the Senior Research Fellow with the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public and International Law in Heidelberg. So she's come from afar to be with us today. She's in town for the week, and we're so happy and honored that you could spend some time with us. I'll just read a bit about your biography, and then you can dig right into the topic. So she heads a project that seeks to identify effective governance models and regulatory approaches for emergent blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, such as cryptocurrencies and smart contracts. A dual-trained lawyer and economist, Julie has taught economic law courses at leading law facilities in North America, in North America, Europe, and Asia, and Africa, Her expertise spans cryptocurrencies, blockchains, distributed ledger technologies, investment, trade, money, finance, regional integration, economic development, public, private, regulatory networks. Thanks so much for being here today. We look forward to your talk. I'll hand it over to you.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome and for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. As Norm just said, I'm a lawyer and an economist. I'm not a cryptographer, a programmer, a developer, as many of you in the room probably are. So save your technical questions for the people that will be talking to you later. I have enough of a working knowledge of this to understand basically how it works, and been grappling with what it means for society. And I get a lot of phone calls from government officials in different countries and in different agencies wondering what it means for them and what they should be doing about it. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that I think stand between blockchain as an idea and its potential. So we hear a lot about the hype, how much is hype and how much is real. So we'll address that a little bit. And let me just say at the outset to a sort of a promo. For those of you who enjoy films, maybe don't know that much about Bitcoin, tonight in Waterloo, actually, we're going to be screening a documentary on Bitcoin called The Rise and Rise of Bitcoin. So you can come over and check out the documentary. It's open to the public, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about the film afterwards if you'd like to see a little bit about the history of Bitcoin. And I've had the opportunity, thanks to CG, to meet a lot of people who are in the film over the course of the past year, and probably a lot of you in this room know a lot of the major players as well. But it's interesting to see just how much the landscape has changed in the 2 years since the film wrapped. So come on over if you're interested in that. So what I'm going to talk to you about today are the 5 things that I think the main challenges stand between blockchain and its potential. And I kind of grouped them into 2 categories, 2 tedious but straightforward ones, and then 3 deceptively simple ones. And I'll be curious to see whether you're surprised as to which things I put into which categories. We can talk about that after. I'm actually from the US, although I work in Germany, so I'm very informal. Feel free to interrupt me, just ask questions as we go, but we will have a Q&A afterwards if you want to save them up for the end, as you wish. Just feel free to raise your hand or shout something out if you want to. So let's start with the tedious but straightforward things that might be keeping blockchain from its potential. One is this question of scalability without centralization. So we all know that blockchains are designed to operate in this decentralized fashion. I'm talking here about public, open blockchains, not private permissioned ones. So, and we all know, or probably most of us know, that in the Bitcoin world, at least where that was originally launched, that idea, we've seen a move towards centralization in mining. This is a graph from blockchain info from a few days ago. And you can see that the 4 biggest mining pools there account for more than 51% of the network for sure. I don't know what the exact, I didn't add up the exact percentages, but it's over half. So there's been a serious trend towards centralization in mining, and that's because of the cost of mining and the way in which the economics work out, essentially. So there's been a lot of discussion about this in the blockchain community, in the Bitcoin community, in the Ethereum community, any blockchain community you can think of. How do you scale blockchains, get them to the point where they can handle enough transactions per second that we can use them for the real world things that we do in our financial system? How can we make it so that we can actually pack all of that information in there that we want to use when we write smart contracts that allow different organizations to interface with each other on the web, and do so much information while keeping it decentralized? How do you do that? There are a lot of things that are being investigated right now. Here's a list of them, some of them, and personally I'm optimistic about this. There just in the last few weeks have been some new tests on the idea of a lightning network, which has been proposed by a number of different folks and being tested by Bitfury, and what's the French company that just did the test on a few weeks ago? Something with an A. They ran a successful test of a lightning type of idea. Sharding. If you're interested in the technical details behind this, have a look at this white paper that I mentioned up there at the top, which kind of gives a quick and dirty explanation. But basically, the scalability obstacle, in my view, I think is a temporary one. It's tedious, it's technical, but it's moving forward, and I think it's going to get solved eventually, both for public and for private blockchains. Private blockchains are a lot easier to scale for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think the public ones will get there too. So the second thing, and this is what people ask me about all the time because I'm a lawyer and I do legal research, is regulatory certainty. is blockchain not progressing to its full potential, or will it not progress to its full potential because there's just too much regulatory uncertainty? And this was certainly true in the early days of Bitcoin, when you saw a bunch of entrepreneurs enter the space and start doing things that actually, it turns out, are regulated things. And if you don't comply with certain types of regulations, you might not be able to get a bank account, you might get subpoenas from Securities and Exchange Commissions wondering what you're doing and why you're not registered with them. You might get notifications that you violated certain laws for not registering as a money transmission business in various jurisdictions. That is certainly a possibility, that you have this sort of regulatory freeze happening because people are afraid to do the wrong thing. And we have seen examples of prominent startups come into the space and then exit the space because they weren't able to satisfy regulatory requirements. And in the wake of New York State adopting this BitLicense, what we saw actually was an exodus of tech firms from New York to other jurisdictions. So there were about 20 Bitcoin-based startups in New York when the BitLicense came into effect. 4 of them stayed, the other 16 left and went to different jurisdictions. And of the ones that have gone through the process of trying to get a BitLicense under New York State law, 1 has been approved, the second one is supposed to be approved or close to being approved, and the others are still in process and maybe might give up. So we'll see. It's extremely tedious. Regulatory uncertainty is a problem, but the good news is that regulators are showing positive signs. I talk to a lot of regulators in my work as an academic, and leading economies are showing a lot of openness to blockchain and cryptocurrencies and related technologies. The UK, Canada, Switzerland, even the US, and Germany, where I live, which is not known as a sort of out in the lead, let's experiment with new types of regulatory strategies economy. Even Germany is showing openness and having a lot of people in to explain to them what is the technology, how does it work, how should we be thinking about it. And there's a continuum for sure. When I go to the UK, you can sit in a room with the Bank of England, and the Bank of England will tell you about all of the crazy ideas that they're looking into and experimenting with, including completely fully digitizing the British pound on a public blockchain. It's not off of their scope of possibility. They're looking at it. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but they're at least, it's on the table for discussion. When I talk to the Bundesbank, they're really far away from that. They're not interested at all in that. They're still trying to figure out whether they should, how they should interface with non-government cryptocurrencies, let alone, adopt some sort of blockchain-based version of the euro that's controlled somehow through the European Central Bank. So there's quite a spectrum here. But the good news is the authorities are open, lawmakers are open, regulators are open. Bad news, there are a lot of people who have good intentions but bad information, and that can lead to bad decision making sometimes. One example of that was the Court of Justice of the European Union toward the end of 2015 had its first decision on a Bitcoin question. And the question that came before the Court of Justice of the European Union had to do with the European VAT directive. So there was a Swedish guy who was operating an exchanging cryptocurrencies for fiat currencies, and the question was, does the European VAT directive apply to his activity? So to know what the answer to this is, you have to know whether cryptocurrencies are currency under the European VAT directive, so that you can say whether or not you have to have value-added tax applied to what he's doing as a service. And the court reached the right decision, but for the wrong reasons. So the court basically said, in its opinion, Bitcoin exists, the only purpose for Bitcoin is to act as a medium of exchange. There's nothing else you can do with it. So that being the case, we should treat it like a currency, and currencies are exempt under the VAT directive, and therefore you don't have to charge VAT on this exchange. He does pay income tax, by the way. This doesn't mean that his business is tax-free, but he doesn't have to collect VAT. But when you look at the reasoning of the decision, it's pretty clear that the court had a fairly limited understanding of what Bitcoin actually is. To just say as a blanket statement that Bitcoin has no function other than to serve as a medium of exchange is just obviously not true, considering what all people are building on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So that's a problem. But here's my view of the scalability and legal regulation. I guess maybe my link's not working. That's too bad because I like this. Now it's disappeared. I like this little video. You can go Google this and look at it, watch it on YouTube. There's an actual real life tortoise and the hare race that somebody filmed and put up on YouTube. And not surprisingly, the tortoise actually wins the race because the hare gets distracted and hops forward and stops and runs around and does other things. But this is what I think the scalability and the legal regulatory questions look like. You make regulation moves forward very slowly, like the tortoise, and it will continue to move slowly, like the tortoise. And the scalability debate will probably hop forward like the hare, and then stop, and then go backwards, maybe get off the track and come back in. But eventually, they will both get to the finish line in their own time. So now, 3 deceptively simple and therefore really hard things that I think need to be addressed. The first one is user experience. Blockchain has a big problem with user experience. big problem with user experience. How many of you own a cryptocurrency or do something active with blockchain? Okay, all right. How many of you own a cryptocurrency and are not tech people? Okay, so how many of you have been able to get your mother or your grandmother or somebody who is not, let's say, under 40 to do something with a cryptocurrency or a blockchain? Okay, we have a couple of really diehard people in the room. We're very good at sort of translating the concepts into everyday language. But this is a big problem. I set my mom up with a Kraken account so that we could send money back and forth between Europe and the US without all these exchange fees and things like that. But I just had to do it for her. I mean, it wasn't working to do it over the phone. I just had to do it for her, basically. So first of all, we have this problem with jargon. Cryptocurrency, blockchain, distributed ledger, mining, nodes, proof of work, proof of stake, Satoshi? What the heck is a Satoshi, right? For most people. Gas, the concept of burning gas on a transaction. Nobody knows what these things mean outside of small rooms like this one, where we discuss these topics.
Or even inside these rooms.
Or even inside these rooms. And the point is, if you kind of watch the film tonight, you'll see this great scene in which there's an American talk show called The Today Show, discussing the internet back in 1993 or 1994. And you see the hosts all talking about what is it and how does it work. And there's something about at, and you have to put this at symbol in. And what does that do? And what does it mean? And what is a hyperlink? And all of this stuff just doesn't make any sense, right? And then somebody asks the question, but what can you do with it, right? And that's where we're at also with blockchain. We've got all these fancy words, and people need to not know those words and still be able to use blockchain. That is the challenge with user experience. So some examples from my own life over the past couple of years as I've dived into the blockchain space with no knowledge and just sort of had to educate myself along the way. Setting up an Ethereum node. When I said I wanted to set up an Ethereum node, I ended up on GitHub. And I did this thing, and I learned about Geth, and then I had to figure out how to install it and how to run it. And most people can't get to the command line of their computer, right? Let alone if you want a drop-down box that says, I agree, and you click on it, you're not going to do this, right? So this is just a simple example. Okay, then this summer, I rode the DAO craze because I wanted to see what's going to happen to this crazy thing. As we all know, those of you who watched it know, it floated, but it was a fun ride. And so I wanted to get my Ethereum wallet, which I'd successfully set up, to show my DAO balance. Well, again, I have to go searching in Reddit and GitHub and all these tech forums, and then I had to do something with a JSON interface. I didn't even know what a JSON interface was. And then I had to go through and sort of look, and there were different people proposing different scripts that I should be running. And I had to go into the command box of the Ethereum wallet and cut and paste all of this code into my command box and run it, and then just pray to God that it wasn't going to crash my entire computer because it could be some horrible evil virus from some jokester who was on GitHub just targeting schmoes like me. So, you try and triple check things, and you over time you learn, oh, this person's reliable, they usually put out good code. But most people don't have time for that, right? Most people don't have time to know this person, I can trust their code, and that person maybe is a troll. It's not realistic. Even just something as simple as buying Bitcoin in the US, which has the biggest market for Bitcoin and Bitcoin exchanges. It used to be that there weren't many exchanges, now we have a lot, and you have a lot of choices. This is Poloniex, the biggest US-based Bitcoin exchange. And if you look at here, this is actually much better. You have something that you can click here in the middle, right? You've got a pretty clean interface, so we're getting a lot closer here. But look at the stuff on the bottom. What can you do here? Well, you've got SMA and 2 email lines, whatever that means, ready for your customization. You can look at your candlesticks in 15, 30 minute and other different increments, and they tell you about your security. Most people don't know what those things are either, unless they're financial traders and they already are in the business of money. So this is not everyday plain English kind of stuff. So here's my rule of thumb for user experience. If in order to perform a desired action, the user has to look something up, perform a technical operation, however trivial it may seem to you, seek help through an online or offline forum, or do anything else that involves leaving the screen that they're on, then it's probably not user-friendly enough yet. And you should rethink it. So that, I think, is a really big barrier to blockchain general mainstream adoption. The fourth thing is something that I call community governance. Lawyers, we like to call this private ordering. And this is a definition of private ordering from a legal scholar from Israel, wrote a book about it in 2004. Private ordering is the process of setting up social norms by parties involved in the regulated activity and not by the state. And it aims to achieve, however, public goals such as efficiency, enhancing the market, and protecting rights. Now, to succeed, community governance, self-governance, private ordering, has to be a few things. It has to be predictable, it has to be fairly stable, it has to be effective, it does what it sets out to do, and it has to be not illegal. And this is, you can call it illegal, private ordering. It exists within the bounds of the law. Here are the boundaries. You can't go beyond this because this is illegal. Within this box, however, you can do lots of different things as long as they're not illegal. They're illegal. We're not going to sanction them, we're not going to condone them, we're just going to let them happen as long as you don't cross these borders. So these things in turn require that whatever your governance structure is, your private ordering scheme, or whatever kind of blockchain community you're trying to build, your governance, your internal governance structure needs to express wide consensus about goals and norms. A lot of debate right now about how wide the consensus should be. Should it be just 51%? Is that enough? Do you want absolute consensus? I can tell you as an economic lawyer that perfect consensus is not a great way to go. It is really difficult to achieve. The WTO has not concluded another successful round of negotiations since Doha. Why? Because every WTO member has to agree to everything before anything is agreed. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and as a result, the WTO has been paralyzed since 2001. This is not a good, perfect consensus is not a workable thing to go for. But you need to have some form of consensus, because otherwise the community itself will revolt, and you'll just have endless splitting of communities, and nobody will be big enough to be effective. You have to adhere to the principle of voluntary acceptance. Now, as a lawyer, this is something that we all know from contract law, offer and acceptance, right? We can order our relationships among ourselves however we want, as long as you voluntarily agree and I voluntarily agree, and we both of our free will sign on the dotted line. And whatever it is we're signing up to is not per se illegal. You have to have voluntary acceptance. But then you also need dynamic capacity to be built into your internal governance system. What happens when the unanticipated happens? And we saw this earlier this summer with the DAO. When somebody finds a hole in your code, a problem with your code, and uses it in a way that the community didn't anticipate and didn't intend, what are you going to do? How are you going to fix that? There has to be an ability to respond to that situation. And then, last but not least, you have to incorporate defined and smooth interfaces with the external, the public ordering system. Now, this is the law, as we know, the big L law, where the state comes in and says, well, these are the borders. And when you get to that border, or something happens that pushes you over that line, you need to have mechanisms for interfacing with the law and the state. This is not natural for the cryptocurrency community because Bitcoin was launched to operate independently and to be sort of libertarian, maybe anarchic, depends on how you read the white paper. But this is just reality. If you want to be able to build something that's sustainable, you're going to have to be able to interface with the external law. So here's a question. Which of these communities do you think has so far done a good job of this kind of private ordering? Predictable, stable, effective, not illegal, and with these characteristics. Wide consensus, voluntary acceptance, dynamic capacity, and a smooth interface with the law. Anybody? Sorry? The Linux Foundation. Any others on that screen that you'd say have done a good job so far?
The others are still around, so I guess decently good job. Except for the EAO.
Right. I think it's still around, but I'm surprised that I keep getting feeds in my inbox from the DAO. Who's still submitting things? but apparently people are. Yeah, so we have up there on the right, we've got the Ethereum Foundation. On the left is a picture from one of the Bitcoin scaling conferences. We've got the DAO, the Hyperledger project. The Linux Foundation, this one's been around for a long time, right? So they have a lot more experience with this. And in the early days, things were probably not as smooth as they are now either. And it was very much built around a person, which can probably also be said of some of the things that are happening and should be said, some of the things that are happening in the blockchain space. So another thing within this community governance thing that was also really highlighted by the DAO's explosion earlier this year is that this is a super crucial loop. Yeah?
Nobody knows what the DAO is. Maybe just
Yeah, other people don't know what the DAO is. Please don't be shy. Raise your hand. Okay. So the DAO stands for Distributed Autonomous Organization, which is another one of those fun jargon terms that we should all know. And what it was essentially was there were some programmers, Germany actually, who decided that it would be a good idea to use the Ethereum blockchain and build on top of that a structure whereby people around the world could contribute Ether, the cryptocurrency of Ethereum, and in exchange get tokens called DAO tokens. And what the tokens would do is that they would allow you to vote on projects for Ethereum development ideas that were proposed to the community. So it was sort of like a blockchain-based crowdfunding / angel investing kind of platform. And the idea was, hey, we should be able to get in at an early stage on these exciting things that are happening, and then when we vote for something and we fund it as a community, if it becomes the next Google or Facebook or whatever, we all get rich on it. Why should the Winklevoss brothers get rich again? Right? Let's let the community of small people who are interested in this make something off of it instead. The problem was the code wasn't very well tested and audited, and it turned out there was a problem in the code. I think that in fairness to them, the developers, these guys didn't slock it. They thought that maybe they'd raise $1 million or $2 million worth of Ether to fund Ethereum-based projects. And what happened was they raised 50, 60 million to become the fluctuating value of Ethereum within 4 weeks, which is a huge amount of money. 50 million. Then you got a big bounty there. You got a $50 million bounty sitting in a smart contract. And if someone can find a bug in the code and start taking the money out of that smart contract, well, that's a pretty good target to hack. And that's exactly what happened. Somebody figured out a way to use the voting mechanism essentially to do something called a recursive attack, where you run a tiny little loop of operations a bunch of times before this final step ever happened, so that it didn't update the balance of the contract. It kept just taking essentially, and over the course of a number of hours was able to drain, I don't remember what the total amount was that was drained, but something like 30%. Sorry? Yeah, I think it was about a third of the value of the DAO over the course of 8 or 9 hours or something like that. So, and then posted on a number of tech forums saying, thank you very much to the DAO community for, I used the code is law, that's what you put on your website when you launch this thing, I used the code, and I thank you for contributing funds. Now, of course, as a lawyer, you look at that and you just say, that's ridiculous. You can say that the code is law, but that doesn't make the code law. And no jurisdiction that I know of would actually just take that at face value and say that was not theft, that was just the law. But that's what happened. So what it showed, though, is that we need a whole new way of doing smart contracts. So the DAO worked on smart contracts. Ethereum, the whole promise of Ethereum is this ability to contract with people that you don't know in other places that you don't trust, and have the trusted result happen without you knowing them. But you cannot do that unless you have some sort of a governance structure that closes the loop between social contract, what we think the community exists to do. The DAO is for raising money for venture capital ideas, right? Not for stealing it into my private personal wallet. That's the social contract. Then you need the smart contract, which is the code, and all the things that it actually executes, which not very many people understand, or ever will understand. And then you have a legal contract, or some sort of a version of a legal contract. And that is what the private ordering is. That's where you and I say, okay, based on what we want to do, we're going to use this code, and here are the rules that we're going to put around it in case something funny happens that we weren't expecting. So this loop is really critical, and not enough people have thought about it. Okay, last thing, and then we'll just have a bit of a discussion. In my view, the last thing that is really standing as a hurdle to a lot of blockchain success is vision. What are blockchains for? And not what are they against, but what are they for? So the original blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, was launched very much with this libertarian idea, get the government out of my money. I want to be able to get around the banks. I want to get around the Federal Reserve. I'm against, right? And it's kind of a negative vision in some ways. People don't really get excited about negative visions in the long term, in useful ways. They don't get excited about things like disintermediation. How many people do you know, if you went and over Thanksgiving dinner you said there's this cool new thing I'm working on, it's called disintermediation. How many of your family members would be like, yeah, go, disintermediate those bad boys? Not really, right? Efficiency, that's great if you're in the corporate world, and we all care about efficiency, better, faster, cheaper, but it's not really that sexy or motivating at the end of the day, right? Everybody knows efficiency is just part of the corporate world, we always strive for it. Sticking it to the government, or the bank, or the feds. Okay, there are some people that want to do that, but they're never going to be a massive segment of society, right? Decentralization for its own sake. There are a number of sort of true blockchain believers who just want to decentralize just because they think it should be done. But what is the value of decentralization? Why are you decentralizing? So those are words that don't get people excited. Things that do get people excited are things like connecting, creating, building, empowering, personalizing, humanizing. These are things that you can do with blockchain. And those are the stories that companies that are trying to do new things with blockchain need to be telling. Not about how we're gonna stick it to the banks and we're gonna get the middleman out of the way. There will be a lot of people who will be happy about that. Trust me, I'm really, really happy that I can send money to my mother and pay a couple of bucks rather than going through this 7 to 10-day process and losing all this money in wire fees and exchange fees. I'm really happy about that. But at the end of the day, it's not that huge of a gain in my life, right? But if people can use blockchains to do things that they couldn't do before, they can contract with people they don't know in countries that they'll never visit for things that they wouldn't have been able to access before. They can build new communities through cryptographically secure messaging systems on blockchains. They can do all kinds of things that they wouldn't have been able to do before. That's valuable. And for me, identity is sort of the linchpin of all of this. Again, coming back to my perspective as a lawyer, there's a great piece in Medium by Vinay Gupta, who's this kind of crazy forward thinker, who says a lot of really brilliant things. And I encourage you to read this if you haven't read it already. It's called Tell Me Who You Are. And he's basically thinking through what does blockchain mean for identity, who we are online, what pieces of our identity do we reveal to whom and for what purposes. Blockchain actually allows us to segment our identities into little slices and reveal, I can reveal my name for this purpose, my credit history for that purpose, my nationality for this purpose. But it's not the case that the government, in order to regulate effectively, needs to know everything about you for every purpose, right? For taxes, they just need to know which treasury gets the tax on this transaction. Is it the German treasury or is it the US treasury? That's all they need to know. They don't need to know all that other stuff. If you think about all the information that came out in the Snowden scandals and things like that, that's just a lot of information that's being collected about a lot of people on a regular basis for corporate purposes, for intelligence purposes, and blockchain gives us an opportunity to think about how we want to control our identities in a little bit more of a thoughtful way online. So, and the time to think about it is now. For those of you who've been watching these developments, we have really anonymized forms of cryptocurrencies coming out. Monero earlier this year sort of shot up out of nowhere. It's sort of like Bitcoin, except that you can't trace the transactions as publicly as you can on the Bitcoin ledger, which makes it a lot harder to figure out who's using it for bad things like drugs, money laundering, and stuff like that. Mimblewimble, and then Zcash is supposed to launch this month. I can't read the launch date on there, but Zcash uses very new cryptographic techniques, untested, unproven. Could be another DAO. It might also explode. We'll see. I've heard very competing views from different cryptographer experts on whether or not this is going to be a good thing or not. But it's going to be really fun to watch. But the point is, these currencies, these new types of blockchain, are using technologies that take this question of identity seriously, or data protection seriously, and it's a good time to start talking about those things. So those are my 2 easy challenges and 3 hard ones. And yeah, I'd love to have some questions. Yeah.
So each of the communities, whether it be Ethereum or Bitcoin, they have already certain governance structures in place. Usually a foundation that is also the core development community. They'll solve whatever bugs come up. They also act as sort of perfect sort of points for interfacing with regulators or with the community generally. But it feels like that's in conflict with the whole idea of decentralization. Do you think we will ever get past the point where we need a foundation to sort of steward the movement through its life?
Whether it has to be a foundation or not, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that's absolutely the case. It's been an effective model for Linux and a number of other types of initiatives in the tech, just in internet development, I guess. But I think that you're never going to get rid of the human dimension. You can decentralize as long as the day is long, but all of those decentralized things are people at the end of the day, sitting on a network together. And people like to communicate, and we live in societies in which we want to come together and decide some things communally. That's social contract. We're always going to have that in some form. So you need spokespeople, essentially, who can interface between the decentralized community and the visible elected community of government. Whether that should be the Bitcoin core team or the Ethereum Foundation or who that should be, I think is definitely an open question and something that's worth thinking about. I saw an academic paper a couple of weeks ago by a legal scholar who was suggesting that core developers in these communities should be treated like fiduciaries because they are essentially making decisions that impact financial outcomes for broad swaths of people. So when the Ethereum Foundation decided, let's write this code and fork the blockchain to make the DAO attack like it never happened, they're essentially putting themselves in that role. And of course you could say, well, the miners at the end of the day decided whether to accept the fork or not, so are the miners fiduciaries? Is it all of us who are on the blockchain who go along with it and don't split off to Ethereum Classic? I don't know, these are complicated questions. But I will say, I'm not sure that I want a bunch of very talented and well-meaning 20-something developers being fiduciaries. They probably should be able to just code and try out new ideas without having to be saddled with that kind of burden. I don't think they want that burden. And I don't see how it's workable to put that them in that burden. But you do need interface between the government and what's happening in the developer community. That's why I said you need to have these private ordering schemes where you have an interface with the external world. And my guess is that the DAO and the Ethereum Foundation, everybody has not been prosecuted or been investigated over the DAO hack. Although I got calls immediately after it happened, what the heck is this and how is it possible to raise $50 million without registering with the Securities and Exchange Commission? I got immediate calls on that. But I think they have not been investigated because they made it right and they fixed it. Bitfinex is being investigated because they tried to make it right, but they used a really novel strategy for doing it. There's a Bitcoin exchange that got hacked also this year. So there have to be interfaces, and you have to figure out those pathways.
Are there any mechanism or of insurance with this transaction? Because each technology can have flaws, yeah?
Yeah.
So how, I mean, for example, if big banks become involved, yeah?
If they
Then
become what, sorry?
involved in the technology, yeah? Then we can talk about huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
So then is there any way to mitigate the risk with an insurance mechanism?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a big topic of discussion. Insurance is definitely one way of mitigating risk, and it's something that we see really often in other sort of transnational business environments. You do transnational business with a company that's in a different jurisdiction than yours. You set up a contract. When you have certain risk factors that you can't control, you might take out a risk. You might take out a political risk insurance contract, for example, on the deal, because you're operating in a country that might just confiscate your investment or something like that. And then in addition, you have this contractual mechanism where if something goes wrong, then you know what law you're going to apply and which court or arbitration you're going to go to in order to figure it out. But yes, definitely insurance mechanisms can play a role, and it might be that a combination of insurance and private ordering schemes would address a lot of the questions about the interface between the public and the private.
So what will be the role of big banks? Because one aspect of blockchain is to cut the costs, yeah? So that will cut in the revenue of the banks. But from what I read, the banks will still have a role like exchanges or kind of guarantees for transactions, things like that.
This is a really fun competition to watch right now from the perspective of an outside observer. So I know we have some bank people in the room here. And there is, you probably read about this big consortium of banks that are cooperating together through a consortium called R3. And essentially what they're doing is they are looking at ways to make their interbank operations that they have to do on a daily basis with settlement and trades and clearing more efficient and faster, cheaper, faster. And the banks have been operating really old legacy systems for a long time that were good enough until there was an outside option, until blockchain came along and sort of put the pressure on. The threat that they could be disintermediated made them say, maybe we need to do this cheaper, better, faster so that we don't lose our market position. And they're very aggressively experimenting with that. They are doing it using private blockchains because they are regulated entities, and also, frankly, because they'll lose business, they'll lose market share if it's done on public blockchains. But at the same time, there are a lot of startups who are asking the question, how can we have stock exchanges without stock exchanges? And there are companies that are building software that do that, creating market-making types of structures without exchanges, without traders, without commodities futures trading commission. And it's difficult for regulators because then you don't have regulated entities anymore. There's no middleman. So how do you do consumer protection or investor protection, et cetera? Yeah?
You mentioned that the Bank of England is considering putting the British pound on a public blockchain. I'm curious, or you mentioned that was being spoken about at Reggie.
Yeah, they're not considering doing it, but they are looking at all the possibilities.
So they haven't actually started developing or putting resources towards that?
No. They have a team. They have an entire team dedicated to blockchain at the Bank of England, and they are very smart people. And they are looking very aggressively at all kinds of different possibilities. And you can imagine if you're the Bank of England, they are tasked with creating a stable financial infrastructure for the entire UK. So it's not like something that you would just do overnight or experiment with in in a willy-nilly fashion. But they are commissioning a lot of research, academic research, as well as tech pilots through think tanks and through a consortium. A special fund was launched in the UK to promote public-private engagement on this topic through the Whitechapel think tank and a bunch of others who are involved in this. And essentially what they're doing is they're saying, okay, what are the possible worlds that we could be standing in front of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road? Is it conceivable to think of the entire global financial system operating on a public blockchain? Is that a conceivable thing? What would you have to give up to get there? Would it be worth the trade-offs? Or are we looking at a world in which we have a whole bunch of sort of digitized fiat currencies interfacing with each other, and what we need to be focusing on is interoperability of blockchains? Is it a combination of public and private? Will there be some countries that just are like, you know what? The reality is we don't have control of our money supply anyway. Our money supply is pegged to the US dollar or to the euro, or it rises and falls with the fortunes of the yen. We really can't affect monetary policy in our country anyway. We may as well just go to a public blockchain or just get on the blockchain of whatever country our economy is tied to. That's a possible outcome as well. But the Bank of England is ahead of the curve in that they're actually talking about those things openly, rather than saying, oh, that's just crazy.
Cool.
Yeah.
You mentioned blockchain interoperability.
Yeah.
What's kind of this current state of the art there in terms of getting people to work? To me, that's one of the big mitigating, risk mitigating initiatives that the community could be participating in, so that we could actually take action today in various silos, knowing that there's a path to interoperability. Any thoughts on that?
My perception is that, again, I'm not a tech person, so I'm not involved in the interoperability discussions. My perception is that it's getting better, for sure. When I first started sort of passively following this space, you would scroll through different forums, and there was a lot of mutual hating back and forth of communities that didn't want anything to do with each other, or that were just vitriolically opposed to other solutions. That's started to tamp down quite a bit, and I think you're seeing a lot more reaching across the aisle, so to speak, to understand what is that team over there doing? Is it something we can interface with? If we do interface with it, do we have to give up one of our core values? And I think that really, at the end of the day, is the right question to ask. If you can work together with these different initiatives without giving up whatever your core proposition is that you're committed to, then why not do it? Because everybody will benefit in the end. That's the whole idea of open source collaboration. And people are starting to see that, so I think the industry is definitely maturing in that fashion. And even the debates on scalability in Bitcoin, which were super personal and ad hominem attacks and just terrible to watch for a while, has started to calm down as well. And we saw at the last conference, there was a lot of talk about how can we jointly experiment on the Lightning Network, different things. So I think it's starting to mature, which is good. And frankly, I think the entry of the corporates into the space has been super helpful in that. When you have people from Microsoft and from SAP and from Deloitte and from all of you, a lot of you who are sitting in the room coming in, they expect a certain level of professionalism in interactions, and that helps a lot. Yeah.
Given the speed of the evolution, what role do you see law firms or the legal community playing within that private order? And if any, how do you get over the legal sector's own difficulties with user experience? Both ways.
That's a great question. Lawyers are not great at user experience either, right? I mean, we write these terrible contracts that nobody can understand, and we've been doing that for hundreds of years. So lawyers are not naturally the people you look to solve the user experience problem. That has to be solved in sort of Apple design kind of way, not by lawyers, not by cypherpunks. It's got to be people who really know things about user design. But the lawyer question is really interesting because it cross-cuts in a lot of different ways. So in some senses, lawyers also can be disintermediated by blockchain and should be. So I'll give you an example from Germany where I live. In Germany, if you want to buy a piece of property, you have to sit down with a notary who is a trained lawyer who has passed all of the state bar exams and everything and makes a few hundred euros an hour. And you have to sit down with the notary, and the notary has to read you out loud the entire contract. And the party that your counterparty, the seller and the buyer, have to sit in the room with the notary and read the whole thing from beginning to end. And the idea behind this was, well, that gives you an opportunity to ask questions if there are terms you don't understand in the contracts, you understand what you're really selling, what you're really buying. But nobody does. Why? Because if you interrupt, you have to pay more money, and it just takes longer, right? So they just sit there, they read it out loud. A friend of mine recently bought a house, it took 7 hours to sit there in the room with the lawyer and have him read out loud the contract. This is not about consumer protection, this is about jobs in Germany. The notary bar really likes this arrangement. They make a bunch of money, very little effort, and they have political power. But there's no reason to have that happening. It's not helping anybody. And if you put the property registry on a public blockchain, and then you do some sort of you use some technical workarounds for making sure that people understand what they're buying and selling. You can set up an online game, actually, that helps, and you sit there and you make the user play the online game. In this contract, I'm paying how much for this property, and give them a multiple choice question, make sure that they get it right. What happens if my neighbor builds a fence on my property line and I don't object to it for 20 years? Well, you lose the right of way to that. Those sorts of things can be done in a much more interactive way, probably cheaper and faster, and certainly more fun than sitting in a room with a notary for 7 hours. So those are the kinds of things that blockchains can enable that will disintermediate lawyers. But then you need a set of lawyers who can sit down and figure out this loop between the social contract, the smart contract, and the legal contract. And there are not many who understand the technology enough to even know what a smart contract is. But there's a certain subset of lawyers. I used to teach international commercial arbitration in Duke. And this was our bread and butter, right? You figure out how to get around the legal system so that you're not in the national legal system. You write your own law, you choose your own arbitrators, you figure out what's going to happen in the case of dispute, you know who's going to pay for it. Everything is sort of arranged in advance. This happens all the time, every single day, in multinational business contexts. And it's actually not that hard to make that happen in the blockchain space as well. But you have to bring in people who have that expertise into the blockchain space. So this is one of my presentations. Other thoughts, questions?
Well, so you'll be here with us for the afternoon. So obviously, if you have questions, we're in a flow break right now. Thank you very much. That was awesome. Great perspective. Coffee, desserts, we got some fruit there, and some water. What we want to do is take some don't leave because we've got 4 more speakers coming up. So Elliot from Regional Labs will talk a bit about, again, peeling the hype layer off the blockchain to talk about some more material practical stuff. He's inside there. We've got Miliana from the Rubik's team to talk about that journey between collaboration and competition, what that can look like, that tenuous battle that we're kind of living right now. My team from the lab is going to walk through the concept. We've implemented international trade finance using the platform developed on Rubik's, now Nuco, and we're happy to have